I'm Gleaves Whitney. This is a continuation of my video essay, Less Pluribus, More Unum. Chapter 5, Consensus and Partisanship in the American Experience. Already we see in the founding of America the bold contours of modernity, with its tolerance for a proliferating variety of beliefs. It is often said that America is a Christian nation, and for the most part it surely is. Such founders as Patrick Henry, John Jay, John Witherspoon were devout Protestants, and Charles Carroll was a devout Catholic. But many of our nation's founders leaned away from doctrinal Christianity and toward the Enlightenment. They accepted Christianity's moral precepts and social norms, but rejected what Christianity had become during the wars of religion. They had read about decades of sectarian violence back in Europe and had turned them off. Thomas Paine was virulently anti-Catholic. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were deists who rejected the passages in the Bible that told of supernatural miracles. Benjamin Franklin, for most of his life, alternated between deism and non-sectarian theism. John Adams was not a Trinitarian, but a Unitarian. He also was quite anti-Catholic. And George Washington, nominally Episcopalian but Sphinx-like about his real beliefs, spoke in the Enlightenment manner of providence and nature's God while avoiding direct references to Jesus Christ and the Bible's supernatural miracles. In all their variety of beliefs, the founding generation established a modern ethos when it came to public proclamations of apodictic truth. They tolerated strong differences with each other, evidenced by their ability to come together to sign the Declaration of Independence and ratify the U.S. Constitution. In their public intercourse are enduring lessons that can aid us in the search for common ground. One of those lessons happens to be the founders' most overlooked achievement, the rhetorical revolution. Autocracies required subjects to listen. Democracies need citizens to speak. We are a rhetorical republic. The perennial charge by the founders to posterity, expressed in the preamble of the Constitution, is to form a more perfect union. That can only be done by communicating the consent of the governed. To arrive at that consent is a messy process. It requires citizens to assemble, speak up, listen in good faith to what others are saying, examine the evidence, cross-examine the witnesses, deliberate on the merits of the arguments, debate good ends and apt means, convince others, settle on the best candidates, and go to the polls, and then hold elected officials accountable. At every stage, the way to self-governance goes through rhetoric. Any hope of finding common ground for the common good goes through rhetoric. A rhetorical republic relies on equality of citizenship, citizens without masters. As Sam Houston liked to say, quote, "I bow to God and there the list ends," end quote. A rhetorical republic also relies on strong institutions. The founders established institutions with built-in safety valves to deal with corrosive selfishness, divisive tribalism, and other vices that bring about separation. Politically, they designed the Constitution to channel disagreement into productive debate about the common good. Economically, they adopted the free market to admit everyone into the marketplace who wants to build a better mousetrap. The free market also gives people wide latitude to pursue their happiness, thereby dissipating envy. Socially, they abolished aristocracy so as to make unlimited upward mobility possible, even for the humblest citizen, which also dissipated envy. And in matters of faith, they gave religions a leash long enough to move throughout society, but short enough to stay on the perimeter of the state. In all these ways, social frictions were lubricated. For a long time, civil war was averted. Now, given our rhetorical republic, it is little wonder that America has endured periods of hyperpartisanship. Given our institutions, it is no surprise that America has enjoyed periods of consensus. Students attuned to the patterns of American history know that the nation's public life consists mostly in long stretches of time spent navigating the tense field between the pole of consensus and the pole of partisanship. In 19th century America, the seedbed of consensus was prepared by a great many Americans reading their King James Bible their Webster's blue-back speller, and later McGuffey readers. The Anglo-American Protestants who were churched and who read these works generally shared a religious, moral, and political outlook that expressed a sense of national purpose and a desire for unity. The era of good feelings when the Federalist Party faded away and the Democratic Republicans consolidated illustrates this. Now, surprise attacks from foreign enemies have always had a way of getting Americans to rally around the flag and support the sitting president, regardless of party. Even before the last bomb dropped on Pearl Harbor, even before the last hijacked plane careened into its 9/11 target, Americans felt united in their horror and their resolve to strike back at the enemy. Consensus marked a few, but by no means all of our wars. The totalitarian threats to our nation in the 20th century generated feelings of unity during and after World War II, at the start of the Cold War. By contrast, there was little common ground on the home front in the War of 1812, in the Mexican War, because large numbers of people thought they were unjust conflicts, contrary to their material interests. In more recent times, as wars in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq wore on, the nation wore out. We lost the will to fight. What began as wars of consensus ended as wars of contentiousness. As these later conflicts suggest, wars can be both the cause and effect of hyperpartisanship. Exhibit A in American history is our Civil War. And don't forget the strife during the decades before and after our American Iliad. They were no picnic. Bleeding Kansas was as disturbing before the war as radical Reconstruction was after it. War or no war, discovering common ground in the U.S. has never been easy. We have been a diverse, opinionated people from the start. Indeed, paralyzing strife goes all the way back to the beginning, to the Washington administration when Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans set their faces against Hamilton and his Federalists. No wonder our first president admonished posterity not to become too fond of political parties. Even when public life excluded pretty much all but white Protestant property-owning males, the first 100 years after ratification of the Constitution saw a mare's nest of potential conflict. Christians against deists, Catholics against Protestants, English speakers against German speakers, slavers against abolitionists, agrarian Republicans against commercial Republicans, people against dogs, the Enlightenment mind against the Romantic mind, sectionalists against nationalists, nativists against immigrants, drinkers against prohibitionists, isolationists against imperialists, rural farmers against the urban proletariat, and on and on and on, all grist for partisan mills. Somehow our ancestors made most of it work most of the time. Despite these contending factions, it was perhaps easier to find common ground in the 19th century, when the range of acceptable public choices was more limited than it is today, when we welcomed the mystery clauses into our public discourse. For many decades after its founding, Americanism was the system that characterized the nation's glue and its ethos. It was associated with the governing policies of Alexander Hamilton, Henry Clay, and Grover Cleveland. Generally, it was the paradigm that a majority of Americans supported. They cherry-picked what those thinkers had given them. As an economic and political program, it enjoyed a large public consensus for most of the 19th century. It was not so much a rigid ideology as a muscular ethos. It valued self-reliance. It cherished the opportunities that civil society afforded individuals in their pursuit of happiness. It favored a relatively strict construction of the Constitution, mostly free markets, railroad subsidies and tariffs being notable exceptions, and restraint by the national government so as not to expand Washington's power at the expense of the states. It was a mashup of 19th century conservative liberalism, or liberal conservatism. As George Will observed, Americans tend to be symbolically and temperamentally conservative, but operationally liberal. These boosters of Americanism went to church. They were not ashamed of being rural. They tended to their civic duties. They did not want barriers to entering the marketplace. They didn't mind that the national government was limited. Even in their fractiousness, most people in the 19th century stayed within the bounds of Americanism. From the 1890s on, however, Americanism increasingly clashed with a new paradigm that was emerging and asserting itself: progressivism. These two isms, Americanism and progressivism, would frame public debate for the next 130 years and show us why consensus has been so difficult to achieve. Progressive ideas gained a purchase on the American imagination during the Panic of 1893, whose effects on ordinary men and women were arguably worse than those of the Great Depression 4 decades later. In response, populists on their farms and laborers in their cities called for government action to provide work and to relieve suffering. Thus would progressive ideas undermine old-fashioned Americanism with its emphasis on self-reliance. The newism was championed by the philosopher John Dewey, the pamphleteer Herbert Croly, and the politicians Robert La Follette. Over time, the ideological teeth of 20th century progressivism would shred the muscular ethos of 19th century Americanism. Progressive ideas and policies made sense to many people in an America that was no longer like the America of the founders, but was industrializing, urbanizing, and modernizing. The progressive adaptation to modernization helped elect Republicans and Democrats, from Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson to Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. Progressives in both parties would spearhead unprecedented changes, bringing about a revolution by evolution. It went by different names: the New Nationalism, New Freedom, New Deal, Great Society, but the goal was unmistakable: to supplant the Founders' Republic with the Progressives' democracy. Nowadays, the progressive agenda is vigorously pushed by such left-leaning Democrats and social democrats as Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Bernie Sanders. Meanwhile, Americanism in the first half of the 20th century eventually morphed into conservatism. Its defenders today are mostly found among Republicans like Rand Paul, Ben Sasse, and Josh Hawley, as well as libertarians like William Weld. Conservatives and progressives have battled each other in a rowdy arena for 13 decades now. Sometimes one side wins a round, sometimes the other. In the long run, they fight to a draw. Since the Great Depression, some 9 decades ago, Republicans have been in the White House 44 years. Democrats, the same, 44 years. Congressional leadership has likewise switched back and forth several times. Although the progressive Franklin Roosevelt prevailed in the 1930s and 1940s, and the conservative Ronald Reagan prevailed in the 1980s, no one party or ideology has entirely dominated Washington within living memory. Sometimes the spirit of innovation has held sway, sometimes the spirit of conservation. But in the field of tension between these polarities, party leaders have been able often to forge common ground on matters of great national interest. On the subject of political leaders, I should add that when I invite speakers to the Hauenstein Center, I remind them they're coming to Ford country, first in the Congress and then in the White House. Gerald R. Ford mastered the practice of working with people whose views differed from his own. How did he raise the social instinct to an art? First, he respected the dignity of others even when it wasn't easy to do. He listened to them carefully. He kept an open mind. He agreed with their good points. He asserted himself slowly. As a result, Ford modeled how to disagree without being disagreeable. He taught that not everyone who disagreed with him was an enemy. He was not debating enemies so much as opponents who were actually or potentially friends. He also taught us that not all debates end in hugs. You cannot abandon your principles just to feel good. You seek common ground when you can. You stand common ground when you must. That concludes Chapter 5 of my video essay, Less Pluribus, More Unum. I invite you to watch Chapter 6. Thanks for dropping in.